Hey, what's up everyone? So when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do for this video, all I could think about was partition. So I was like, yeah, okay, sure, that's fine. And so while I was doing my research, I realized, well, I can't just talk about partition itself, I have to give some background information. So I was like, okay, well, let's go back and talk about some of the points in history where England was in charge over India. And so as I'm looking at all this, it's like, okay, well, this event happened, and this event happened. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't just say, oh, well, then the Indians had the revolt against the British. Moving on. So then I realized I have to have a bunch of history on those as well. So I found myself going down so many rabbit holes that I had to just stop doing research and make a video of what I had already found. Because of how much information is in this, I'm going to have to make this into two parts. The first part is going to pretty much cover from England taking over India up until about the 1920s, and then part two is going to cover from about World War II up until actually partition and go into a little bit of what's going on today over in the area. So because of how much we have going on, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date every time I upload a video. And also, if you have anything you want me to cover, go ahead and tweet me at Alavania Molina, or you can go ahead and just comment down below.
Okay, so literally right when I decided to sit down and record, my camera decided to die. So we're doing it this way because I just want to get this video made and up for you guys. The Viennese were the only ones who had control of the Silk Road for a really long time, and they were getting all the profits from the silk, the spices, the fine china, and other precious materials. They didn't want to have to rely on Vienna and pay to them. They wanted to have their direct route. In 1488, Portugal decided to sail around Cape Good Hope in Africa, and so then they established a trade route via the sea. And so then once they did that, everyone else realized that they were able to do that as well. They wouldn't have to go through Vienna. Initially, when the Europeans went over to Asia, they didn't have the goal of colonization. They actually just wanted to establish trade routes. The English ended up having their charter signed in 1600 to establish the British East India Company. They actually found themselves competing with the French East India Company. So the English ended up trading cotton, silk, tea, and opium, and then they found themselves fighting with the French in the Carnatic Wars, and it was to see who would establish dominance in the Indian area. In 1955, Siraj Udala was the Nawab of Bengal, and he adopted a pro-French policy, and so the British were not happy about that. There were a lot of accounts of this thing called the Black Hole of Calcutta, where a lot of the British were being abducted and left in to die. So the British sent over this guy named Robert Clive, and he decided that he was going to have one of the Nawab's generals, Mir Jafar, be a double agent for them. They bribed him with the idea of being able to have a seat on the throne if he would help the British. And so then the British were going to Bengal, and they met the Nawab in the French army at the Battle of Plassey. On June 23rd, 1757, Robert Clive actually marched his army to the Bengali capital, Murshidabad, and he actually ended up meeting with the Nawab army at Plassey. The Nawab army had 50,000 people, and the British only had 3,000, and so the British were kind of freaking out a little bit. And the Nawab army actually had the French artillery helping them, and the English only had 3,000 people, and they didn't really have any of the artillery. French opened fire first, British returned it, and they tried to bomb the British, but when they returned fire, it missed the artillery and hit the Nawab army, so the Nawab army started trying to run away. So it kind of ended up being like a stalemate until it started raining. So given how the muskets worked back in the day, they had to keep their gunpowder dry. And so the British actually had tarps that they were using to keep their dry, but the Bengalis didn't have that. And they didn't think that the British would, so they decided that they were just going to charge them. Well, when the Nawab army charged them, the British opened fire on them. And then they ended up taking a French cannon and firing it on them. And the Nawab actually ran away on the back of a camel during the fight. And so it was a victory for the British. The British did end up putting Mir Jafar into power after he refused to help the Nawab fight the British. And when he was put on the throne, he was kind of just like a British puppet. So in addition to now having a puppet on the throne, they also took the modern equivalent of about $5 million from the Bengali treasury and they also took a whole bunch of land as well. In 1770, they were heavily taxing the Indians, similar to how they were heavily taxing the colonists of America. These taxes were so heavy that the Bengalis ended up becoming impoverished. So while the soldiers made their fortune, the Indian people starved to death. But between 1770 and 1773, 10 million Bengalis actually starved to death, which was about a third of their population. The Indian people are also considered by the British to be inherently corrupt and untrustworthy, so they weren't even allowed to hold high offices in their own land. So over the next 80 years, India started getting really freaked out about the British being there and rapidly changing their culture and what they viewed as trying to Christianize the country, which, to be fair, is probably not very far off. There was one instance in particular where the British sent over these new cartridges for their rifles. And to get into the cartridge, it was in this packaging. And you had to bite the package and rip it with your teeth. There were some rumors floating around that the packaging was actually greased with either pig or cow fat, which is very offensive to basically everyone in India. Hinduism forbids the consumption of cows, and Islam forbids the consumption of pig. So, if it is, greased like this, then this is a really huge issue. And so, because they didn't want to have to deal with this whole revolt and all this, the British were just like, okay, you know what, fine. We'll, to make you happy, we'll just give you new cartridges. And we promise these are not. And so, rather than taking it as the British doing something nice, it just kind of solidified in the Indians' minds that the original cartridges were, in fact, greased with pig and or cow fat. The sepoy, who are like the Indian soldiers who work for the British, they weren't the only ones who were upset with them. The elite families were also really upset because the British changed the inheritance laws. And so they essentially said that if you adopt a kid, that kid can never ascend to your seat of power. And so this was a way that the British was able to control the areas that they didn't actually control. And on top of that, the landowners were really mad because the British came in, and this is post-Enlightenment, and so they thought the caste system was just crazy. And so they decided that the landowners didn't need all that land, so they took it from them, redistributed it to everyone. And so obviously they're mad because they just lost their land, and the peasants were actually really mad too because the British raised the taxes so high. The British East India Company also was banning certain cultural practices. The most notable of this was sati, or widow burning. So basically what would happen in Hindu culture back then is when a man died, his wife would be thrown on his funeral pyre, and if not that, she would be buried alive with him. And the British thought this was completely barbaric. They banned the practice of it, and that really made the Hindus mad. The British were also over there preaching Christianity to the Hindus, and so they believed that their religion was under attack, which, again, it most likely was. So everybody in India felt pretty disrespected by the British. It wasn't even just those of the lower class, even those who were like princely or Brahmins or anything like that. So the British could come in and do pretty much whatever they wanted to, and they wouldn't get in trouble for it. If they did end up getting tried for these crimes, it was very unlikely that they would get convicted. And if they did get convicted, there were a lot of ways where they could just do endless appeals to where it would just eventually go away. And so the Indians felt very threatened by this. It made it like a racial superiority of the British over the Indians. In March of 1857, there was this one guy who he just had enough of the British. And so he was in his post and he attacked the British officers. So he was arrested, tried, and executed all by early April. And so then, after that, the other sepoy were like, you know what? No, we're not dealing with this anymore. And so a group of them decided that they weren't going to accept the cartridges that the British were sending over. And so the British decided to jail them and give them a very long prison sentence. And so after that, the rest of the sepoy were like, no, you aren't going to tell us what to do anymore. On May 10th, just 2 months after the original attack, the sepoy in Bengal decided that they were going to shoot the British officers, and they were going to march to Delhi, where there were no European officials there, and so they didn't have to deal with it. And this ended up sparking the Indian Mutiny of 1857. When they marched to Delhi, they nominally gave back power to the Mughal Emperor Badadushar II. And so this kind of set the focus for the entire mutiny, and northern India pretty much followed suit. And so the Mughal emperor and his sons helped with the mutiny, but not really anybody else important did. So the sepoy ended up shooting British officers whenever they could, essentially, and this started a whole bunch of massacres in places like Delhi and Kanpur. And they were even shooting women and children. And so the British decided to go after them for this. Now, to be fair, the British also kind of took severe actions against them before they even knew about the murders. So to ensure their victory, British handled this in 3 different steps. The first took place during Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow in the summer. The second stage was led by Sir Colin Campbell, and it was in Lucknow during the winter of 1857 to 1858. Sir Hugh Rose led the last campaign, which was kind of to just mop up the rest of it. Peace was declared on July 8th, 1858. Even though some of the British officers were against it, some of the sepoy who had mutinied were either bayoneted or fired from cannons. The emperor was actually blamed for the revolt, even though he only had a small part in it. The British exiled him to Burma, and it officially ended the Mughal Empire that lasted the last about 300 years. So after the revolt, the British East India Company was actually dissolved, and the government came in and they decided they were going to rule India, and this was known as the British Raj. The mutiny ended up being this giant financial hole, and so they had to just reorganize the whole way that they were handling their money in India. The British didn't want to rely on the Bengalis anymore, and so they actually started recruiting soldiers that were more like martial races, and these were more warlike people, which mostly were the Gurkhas, who were the ethnic Nepali who lived in India, and as well as the Sikhs. The British Raj decided that they were going to allow India to have some representation. And so they had a legislative council back in 1853, but it was all Europeans who basically acted like they were a real parliament. And so the British Raj decided that they were going to involve the Indians to see what they could do to better their lives. The next council in 1861, basically they still let the English do all the public works projects they were working on, like their roads and their railways and all those. And these were especially important for the British because if they had their railroads, they could just load their troops up on them and ship them to wherever they needed them in the subcontinent as soon as they could. They also called for the immediate end of the British trying to attack Hinduism. So how did the Indian people react to this? Not well. So their traditional society just tried to rise up and fight back to the British, but they horribly failed. Their princes and their leaders either just didn't care about the mutiny, or the ones that did care were now seen as being incompetent. They were starting to now lose hope that they would ever go back to their traditional society pre-Western contact. So this pretty much broke down the class system, and it developed this big middle class that had this very large Indian nationalism. By 1905, Bengal had become so large, it had about 85 million people in it, that it was just this administrative nightmare for the British. So they decided that they were going to just split it up. Lord George Nathaniel Curzon, which was the viceroy of India at the time, announced it in July, even though it didn't take place until October of 1905. Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, and they had all been together since the 1765. But East Bengal was actually being neglected for West Bengal and Bihar. East Bengal was more of Muslims rather than Hindus. So basically, Lord Curzon's government decided they were just going to split it up. They didn't care about linguistics or anything like that. They just wanted to separate them. This essentially created a Muslim province and a Hindu province. And the sad part of this is the Indian people didn't even want the partition to take place. There were tens of thousands of leaders in Calcutta who had signed a petition against it, and the British didn't care, and they just did it anyway. The Indian National Congress political party decided that this was a way of divide and rule, which we'll go over more of that in a second. They were able to change their small influence into a mass national movement. They called for Swaraj, or basically self-rule, and this would become their main mantra until their independence. And it wasn't even the people in the National Congress who were unhappy. There was a sect of Hindus who worshipped Devi, the mother goddess. These mother-worshipping Hindus saw this as the British splitting up their mother province, and it led to mass rallies and protests all over the province. There was a new tide of national sentiment that kind of spread all through Bengal, and it spread through the rest of India as well. The Bengali Hindus started calling for a boycott of all British goods, and so that even included the clothes that they wore. It became high fashion to wear either hand-spun or hand-woven saris, and these were things that only came out of India, even the Indian cotton, just everything. And so they even made it a point to talk about how much they hated the Lancashire textiles that they actually just made a giant bonfire and burned them all. They even set up Vedic sacrificial altars, and Hindus all around the area went to these altars. Queen Victoria decided she wanted to better the lives of all the Indians with the British government, and they called this autocratic patriotism. So essentially what they did was they decided what was best for the Indians was to completely cut out their society, everything they loved. And they were now going to go to British schools. They were going to learn the British way of doing everything. Queen Victoria had decided that divide and rule was the best practice to be able to effectively rule them. And essentially what they did was they pitted the Hindus and the Muslims against each other, so they would be too busy fighting against each other to care about the British being there. And this divide actually encouraged the formation of the Muslim League in 1907. So the first meeting of the Muslim League was actually held in Dhaka, which was the new capital of Bengal. And they also felt that if nothing changed, they were going to live in a very Hindu-dominated society, and they were going to be treated unfairly. They felt that there was a martial and administrative superiority of the Hindus over them. 6 years after Bengal was partitioned, on December 12, 1911, they reversed it. And while a lot of people were really happy about this, the Muslims who were living in East Bengal, who were doing really well during this, were very unhappy and disappointed, and this resentment would actually last through the entire rest of the British control. And so then the British were like, okay, fine. So they decided to set up boundaries via linguistic lines rather than just religious ones. So then the British declared war on Germany in 1914, and they were essentially like, hey, we do, and so does India. And India is just kind of sitting in the corner like, what? Because they didn't even ask them. They just decided that India was going to go to war with them. India sent about 13 million soldiers to go fight in the war, and ultimately about 13,000 of them were going to end up being killed. So most of the Indians rallied around the British flag because they felt that if they were very supportive in the war, that England would kind of do them a favor and give them independence. And one of the leaders that they were underneath was this new political leader named Mahatma Gandhi. And so then everyone found out about India helping Britain in the war, and so they became having this huge surge of popularity. They even helped found the League of Nations. They actually competed in the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp under the name Les Angles, or basically British Indies. The Indian National Congress saw this as a step towards greater self-government. Some of them weren't very happy about this, though. In February of 1915, there was another mutiny being planned called the Ghadar Mutiny. And they were going to stage a revolt, while the British were too busy over in Europe to even care what they were doing. But the organization that was planning all this actually got infiltrated by the British, and all of their leaders were arrested, so the mutiny never happened. But this led to an increase of the British trusting the Indians even less. So they were still pretty pissed off about the almost could-be mutiny a couple years later. So on March 10th, 1919, the British passed the Rowlatt Act. Essentially what this said was anyone that they thought was a revolutionary could be arrested and jailed up for 2 years and lose their right to a jury trial. They didn't even have to have a warrant for their arrest, and they had no right to face their accuser or even see the evidence against them. They also placed strict controls on the press. And so obviously this angered the Indians. The British ultimately arrested these two political leaders who had ties to Gandhi in Amritsar. And somehow these two people just happened to magically disappear inside the prison system. So basically after this, there were these violent scuffles in Amritsar over the next month. They decided to bring in their military commander, Reginald Dyer. And he was a special character, to say it nicely. So basically, he decided that Indian men had to crawl on their hands and knees in public streets. Ew. And also, they were allowed to publicly lash anyone who walked up to a British officer. No, I'm serious. By April 13th, 1919, they had gotten so insane that they had decided to ban groups larger than 4 people being in one area at one time because they were afraid that they were going to be conspiring. That same day that they decided this, the Indian people had just become fed up. They went to the Jallianwala Gardens in Amritsar. They were having protests there and just basically being mad. So Dyer decides that this was them trying to conspire against them. So he brings about 80 soldiers with him, and they block all the exits to the gardens, and they march in. They also had some armored cars with machine guns mounted on top of them, but luckily they weren't able to fit into the pathways of the garden, so ultimately, thankfully, they were useless. Without warning, Dyer told his soldiers to just start firing and aim for the most crowded areas. Of course, all the people who were there started freaking out because they were being shot at. And so they end up trampling each other, trying to get away, but they can't because they had blocked all the exits. And so people were even trying to jump down this deep well just to avoid all the gunfire. But when they jumped down the well, they were either drowned or they got crushed. The shooting lasted for about 10 minutes, and there were ultimately about 1,600 shell casings that had been expended. And Dyer had only called for a ceasefire when they ran out of ammunition. So then the authorities decided to impose a curfew. This made it to where the families couldn't go and tend to the wounded. And so there were many people who probably bled out waiting in the garden just overnight to die. The official report says 379 people died, but it's actually probably a lot closer to 1,000. This became known as the Amritsar massacre or the Jallianwala massacre. And of course, the British wanted to conceal all this, and they didn't want it to get out to the rest of India or even over to England. But, of course, it did. And the Indians were just outraged. People who were just regular citizens who didn't care about politics suddenly were politicized. And the Nationalists pretty much lost all hope that the British would treat them well, even though they gave such support during World War I. A lot of historians credit this particular act to be a very key part in India's independence. So Dyer got called back to England to testify about the event. Essentially what he says was, I didn't give them warning because I wasn't trying to disperse the crowd. I was trying to punish India generally. And if he had been able to get the cars in like he had wanted, he would have killed a lot more people. The British government decided to relieve him of his duties, but he was never prosecuted. So while all this is going down, there was this new two-nation theory. So because of the whole divide and rule thing that Queen Victoria had put into place, the Hindus were starting to see Muslims as non-Indian foreigners and second-class citizens. They also wanted the expulsion of Islam from India. They wanted to ban all conversions to Islam, but they were also okay with them reconverting to Hinduism. Okay guys, so that's where we're going to leave off in this video. Next week I'll put up part 2, which is going to cover from World War II up until actual partition, and I might even discuss a little bit of what's going on today. So I'll see you guys next time.